I'm Mimi Gersbauer, Director of the Peace Studies Program here at Gustavus, and thank you all for coming tonight. The Raoul Wallenberg Memorial Lecture was established at Gustavus in 1983 and honors the heroism and legacy of a Swedish hero during World War II, Raoul Wallenberg, who was a businessman and diplomat who acted courageously to rescue many Hungarian Jews. I believe this is the first time we've had someone in the field of communication studies or media here for the lecture, and it is about time, as media is a powerful force both for war and peace in our world. Thus, I'm very pleased to introduce this evening's speaker, Dr. Joellen Fair, who is Professor of Journalism and Mass Communications at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her work has focused on how U.S. media portrays African conflicts and on media within Africa and its influence on popular culture. She has done field work and trainings in many African nations. In 2001, she was invited to Ghana to develop a training protocol for Ghanaian journalists preparing to report on the proceedings of the country's National Reconciliation Commission, which was charged with uncovering abuses of past authoritarian governments. She has facilitated journalism training workshops in Zambia and Namibia and helped with curriculum development for the Media Studies program at the University of Namibia. Fair is the editor of the academic journal African Issues and on the editorial board of several African Studies journals and Communication Studies journals. She has also served as research chair and president of the International Communication Division for the Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communication. I know from scheduling the Wallenberg lecture this year that Dr. Fair is a busy scholar, so I thought it might be wise to try and get her to Gustavus while her daughter, who is currently a junior and majoring in Spanish, is still here. So Mela was in my Latin American politics class last spring, and as we were discussing the truth commissions after the military dictatorships in Argentina and Chile, Mela told me a bit about her mother's work and even procured for me a copy of Dr. Fair's fascinating book on the art of truth-telling about authoritarian rule, which Fair and her co-editors put together as a collection of visual culture from Nigeria, South Africa, Latin America, Thailand, the Balkans, and more, that witnesses to the truths of authoritarian past. Tonight, Dr. Fair will speak on Not a Simple Story, Mass Media and Mass Violence, the African Case. Please help me welcome our guest.
I have to tell you, can you all hear me? Is this okay? Technology is not my strong suit, so we'll still probably have more glitches as we go along, but hopefully not. I am extremely honored to be delivering the Raoul Wallenberg Memorial Lecture at Gustavus Adolphus College. I'd like to thank Professor Mimi Gersbauer, and the faculty of the Peace Studies program for thinking of me and for doing such a splendid job in preparing and accommodating me in the weeks leading to this talk, and also over the last the last 24 hours. I have incredibly high regard for Gustavus Adolphus College. Now, please bear with me as I embarrass my daughter in the audience, with several of her friends making this all the more embarrassing. When my daughter, Mela Shaw, I'm naming her, who was a Gustavus Jr., told me that she was going to apply to come here for college, I was one part thrilled and one part terrified. I was terrified because I wasn't sure she'd get in. And it was so much, sorry, Mela. This was so much the place that I really wanted her to come to college, that I really felt in some ways my parenthood was on the line. So when she was admitted and when she agreed that this was the place that she wanted to come to college, well, I have to say sincerely, it was one of the happiest days I've had as a mother. Every contact I've had with Gustavus Adolphus College as a gusty parent confirms what I strongly suspected 3 years ago. This is a jewel of a college, and you are all so lucky to be here. Raoul Wallenberg's moral vision and courage reverberate around the beautiful knolls and walls of this college, around Christ Chapel, around the stark and strangely Swedish contemplative beauty of Linnaeus Aurelian. In case you don't know, Gustavus Adolphus College is a living insistence on moral clarity, kindness, and decency. And you've been entrusted with this for a span of time. And we're counting on you, students, to keep it up. Now, my subject is a dark and heavy one. Not a simple story, mass media and mass violence, the African case. But I'd like to start us out on a lighter note. Even though our subject is heavy, there's a place for humor. In fact, any of you who've spent any amount of time anywhere in Africa know the importance that Africans in general attach to the alternation of heaviness and lightness, laughter lessening the burden of life. So I'd like to play, if everything works here, a little clip.
Filling in for Clifford Baines, whose autobiography is due today, with allegations of fraud surrounding the election of Mario Yar'Adua in Nigeria. How do you think global petroleum markets are going to react, particularly considering their understandable wariness of the crumbling infrastructure and continuing civil strife in the Niger Delta?
Certainly, that's an important question.
Certainly.
One with no easy answers.
Yeah.
A lot of issues are at play here.
I agree. This gentleman that you mentioned certainly needs our trust and support now more than ever.
You
Yes.
mean Mario Yar'Adua?
Yes, Emily.
Well, I
exactly.
think that the reason that this situation is so volatile is because of the factors involved.
That's exactly what I was just going to say.
I just want to overlooking here. I mean, we all know clearly that Nigeria has a 14 million population. Main export is uranium. National language is French, and 18% of its livestock is exported. So they have a very strong agriculture and economic situation going on. I don't think that's being addressed here at all.
And also, we want to differentiate between Nigeria and Niger. Okay, those are not only separate countries, but they're small Nigeria.
Nigeria.
But the real question is, does Yar'Adua have the necessary political skills to implement plans that have already been put into place by Babangida? Particularly, I would say, the International Monetary Fund Structural Adjustment Program.
Yes.
I would say yes.
The comparisons of them.
But do you see Yar'Adua following in the steps of outgoing President Olusegun Obasanjo, or more like former President Ibrahim Babangida?
First one.
The second.
That you think is more in line with Babangida, right?
I disagree.
They're very different.
With whom?
We said the first one.
So the question is, what choice will he be making?
The right choice is to support the right answer, which is the exact answer.
That you had said this is a great
I
question.
have to say that I disagree.
Yeah, I don't agree with that.
I acknowledge.
So the clip that you just, I need to turn this on. So, the clip that you just saw is about Americans' general lack of knowledge about Africa, especially American news media's general lack of knowledge. Some people find it disturbing that most Americans don't know much about Africa. But to tell you the truth, this doesn't bother me so much. It's not that I'm in favor of ignorance. It's just that I don't think our factual ignorance about Africa is vastly worse than our factual ignorance about other places. We Americans don't know very much about India, or Indonesia, or China, or Russia, or South America. It would be great if Americans were more knowledgeable about the rest of the world. But it's also true that we can't know everything. I'm personally less concerned about the things that we don't know than I am about the things that we think we know, but which are false or misleading. For the next 5 or 10 minutes, I want to talk about the things lots of Americans, including people in the media, think they know about Africa. These aren't factual things like the population of Nigeria or the capital of Burkina Faso. These are impressions that many Americans have about Africa. These are background biases. And because they are wrong or misleading or misconstrued, these biases impede us from assembling factual knowledge and make it hard for us to think rationally about Africa. They also demean Africans. The origin and the development in the West of negative ideas about Africa is not a subject that we've got a lot of time to delve into tonight. So for our purposes, just let me offer a very, very quick summary. Africa in the Western imagination before the 17th century or so was not especially stigmatized. Westerners saw Africa as a mysterious land, but Westerners, and really we're talking here Europeans, still were mystified about much of the world at the time. Africa was reputed to harbor all sorts of strange varieties of nature and humanity, but so were all unknown regions of the world. Up through the 1600s, Africa wasn't particularly demonized, at least not any more than any other unfamiliar region. In fact, if you look at the art of that period, you will find black angels and black saints. However, beginning about the 17th century, Africa in the Western imagination began to take on qualities that are still familiar to us today. A dark continent inhabited by tribal people, lacking civilization, lacking development, lacking discipline, lacking orderliness, lacking the capacity for effective self-rule, predisposed towards physicality rather than anything cerebral, swinging wildly on the moral pendulum between helpless victimhood and horrible, primitive, primeval cruelty. It's not a coincidence that Western racist ideas of Africa arose along with the transatlantic slave trade. Perhaps the West needed psychologically some kind of justification for transporting millions and millions of Africans unwillingly across the seas. If we could just define Africans as not fully human, then the slave trade might not seem so morally reprehensible. In any case, all that I'm arguing here is that Western racist ideas of Africa have a history, have a long history. And that's a history that can be explained. Contorted views affect the way that our media depict Africa, particularly the way that they depict violence in Africa. This is true despite that most persons and most organizations, to give the benefit of the doubt, responsible for these depictions are people of goodwill, are people of good intentions, are not horrible racists, but they're stuck in these old conceptual categories and can't get out. Or they know their audiences are stuck there. If you're in the news business or in the mass entertainment business, your audience attention span is something very important to you. If you're reporting on Africa or making a movie that's set in Africa, and you know your audience has fundamental biases about Africa, it's easy to decide to work within those biases rather than to challenge them. Because alas, you don't have the time or the luxury to educate. Or alas, it's not your job to educate. So what about these biases? What misleading, misconstruing, false concepts of Africa do the vast majority of persons and countries like the United States hold? Well, there are quite a few of them. But for this evening, as we slide into our subject of media depictions of mass violence, I want to lay out 4 basic, but 4 fundamentally wrong, incorrect, misleading assumptions that come up again and again. And once I've talked about these 4 assumptions, I'll move into the heart of my talk, demonstrating with examples from the media how these assumptions, these biases, these stereotypes turn complex realities into simple stories, turn something resembling truths into utterly simple fictions. Now, the first of these assumptions, these ideas, these basic background deep biases that we have, is that Africa is our opposite. Africa as the anti-West. The idea that Africa stands in stark contrast to us has a long, long history in Western civilization. It comes down to polarities, to opposites, white and black, Christian and heathen, civilized, uncivilized, complex, simple, efficient, inefficient, self-governing, in need of help, the spoiled, unspoiled, devious, and innocent. And I could go on and on. What's very interesting about this idea is that it cuts both ways. If Africa is our opposite, then where we are good, Africa is not so good. But when we are bad, Africa has a lot to offer us. I'm saying that many of our ideas about Africa are negative and gloomy, and we're familiar with those. And I'm going to talk about several of those in a few minutes. But I want you to remember that if our greatest bias about Africa is our tendency to view Africa as the anti-us, as our opposite, then by definition, not all is doom and gloom, because we know that we Westerners are not always so great. We can admire Africa, we can have hopeful thoughts about Africa, partly because we like Africa to be our opposite. Therefore, we locate some oppositional perfection, or at least some kind of oppositional goodness in Africa. We want to look to Africa not only for bad things, but also for innocence, for happy, simple village life, for nobility, for community, for unspoiled nature. Africa stands in stark contrast to us. The second of these assumptions, still strong among media producers and audiences, is related to the first one. In fact, for the bias that I just described to you to hold up, for us to be able to hold on to ideas of Africa as our opposite, both negatively and positively, we pretty much have to have the second idea. And here it is. Africa is a land of great and sometimes inexplicable moral contrasts. In other words, Africa is a land of great evil and great good. We expect and we want from Africa a stark binary morality. Contemptible violence is endemic in Africa, we want to think. But we also want and expect to find in Africa pure and noble victimhood. More than other places, we want and expect to find in Africa absolute good guys and absolute bad guys. Black and white, good and evil, and not a lot in between. Our third assumption is that of primordialism. What do I mean by primordialism? Well, we know that humanity in Africa goes back into the most distant human past. Africa is the cradle of humanity. We know that until recently, not much of Africa's history or historical record was written and available. In fact, for a very long time, historians would argue that Africa had no history until the colonial period. And to the extent that Africa's history has been written, we haven't read it. We don't understand anything at all about African history. So we tend to attribute anything that happens in Africa to mysterious troubles, tensions, animosities, superstitions, customs, habits, cultures that originated in the deep, utterly unknowable primordial shrouds of a land without a past, a land before time. We want to assume that the bad stuff happening in Africa has an ancient history that we couldn't possibly understand. And Africans probably can't understand either. Because the cultures, the tensions, the customs, the hatreds are ultimately reasonable for the thing that is happening that are rooted in Africa as unknowable in this distant past, nothing really ever seems to change. Old hatreds are just constantly bubbling up in Africa. And so that's what we automatically assume. That's what we automatically think. And finally, there's tribalism. One of the few things that many Westerners do know about Africa is that there seems to be lots of different groups who live there. Well, Africa is home to something like 2,000 different ethno-linguistic groups. Now, the concept of ethnicity, or the concept of the African tribe, has its own complicated history, which we also don't have enough time to really go through. But if you're not an African specialist, it might be surprising to you to learn how thoroughly African historians and African anthropologists, especially those born in Africa, have taken apart and taken down the idea of the primordial African ethnic group. It turns out that while there is a lot of cultural and linguistic diversity in Africa, the hard and fast division of the peoples of Africa into distinct ethnic groups or distinct tribes was, a lot of it, a product of the categorizing obsession of the European colonizers, of European officials, missionaries, anthropologists during the 19th and the 20th centuries. To a surprising degree, the ethnic categories that we tend to think of as ancient divisions were in fact created just 100 or 200 years ago. Largely, again, for the convenience of Europeans obsessively wanting to categorize Africans. So I want to stress here that there has always been a great deal of cultural diversity in Africa. I'm not saying that that's not true, but the categories, the sharp divides that we often think of as fundamental to Africa, in fact, are quite recent inventions. Now, I realize I'm getting slightly sidetracked now, but my point is this, is that media audiences in the West know, or they think they know, that Africa is packed with tribes. And tribal loyalties and ancient tribal animosities must be very important in Africa, we assume. And since we don't know very much else about social organization in Africa, everything gets reduced to tribes. When Africans commit violence upon other Africans, we just assume, tribal stuff, and we leave it at that. Western media portrayals of mass violence in Africa inevitably simplify complex historical and political realities by playing into the four types of biases that I just outlined. They reduce nearly all Africa stories to one degree or another to these biases. They perpetuate grievous simplifications. In the next part of my talk, I'm going to try to show you how this works. And in the process, I'm going to talk about a couple of cases using examples from our media. And in doing so, I'll contrast the simplifications that result from these biases that I've outlined with stories that Africans or African specialists believe are closer to the truth or closer to a more robust understanding of the situation. Before I go into this, though, I want to make one thing completely clear. I'm going to show you examples of grievous evil perpetrated by some people against others. In arguing that Western media simplify the stories of what happened in these cases by reducing them to familiar stereotypes, I'm not suggesting that real Africans didn't commit real acts of atrocities. In fact, the whole point of my being here, the whole point of my taking on this subject, is to suggest that we need, in every case, whenever possible, to look at the hard causes of atrocities, not to fall back on simplifications, not to fall back on what we think we know or we think we assume to be the case about Africa. So our first example, let me come back. So, people are capable of terrible things, but they don't generally commit violence for vague, mysterious, incoherent, primordial reasons. There are always political and economic explanations for acts of evil. The real explanation is never, oh, that's just the way those people are. Now, my first case that I'll talk a little bit about is Rwanda. The Rwandan genocide in 1994 was the most horrendous mass atrocity perpetrated on Earth since the Holocaust that Raoul Wallenberg did his part to fight. Most of you who are students today were young children in 1994 and don't remember the Rwanda genocide. And those of you who are old enough to have been following the news in 1994 remember the genocide, but in particular, you probably remember more about the aftermath of the genocide because that was really what was covered. You remember when thousands and thousands of Rwandans fled the country into the eastern part of the neighboring country, Zaire, or now called Congo. In about 100 days, in April, May, and June 1994, some 600,000 to 800,000 Rwandans were murdered. Specifically, Rwandans who identified themselves as Hutus killed Rwandans who identified themselves as Tutsis. Also, Hutus killed other Hutus whom they thought to be sympathetic to the Tutsis. This has become clear. What made the events of 1994 a genocide is that most of the people who were killed were targeted on the basis of their classified ethnicity, Tutsis. Now bear with me for a little short history lesson here, and I promise it will be short. Remember earlier that I mentioned European colonial officers, missionaries, anthropologists, and others in the 19th and 20th centuries had a penchant for categorizing Africans? Well, Rwanda is the classic example of this. Before Europeans arrived, Hutus and Tutsis weren't so much ethnic categories. In fact, Hutus and Tutsis speak the same language. So Hutu and Tutsi were not so much ethnic categories as they were economic categories. Landholders and owners of cattle were called Tutsi, and those who worked the land, farmers, were called Hutu. But a Hutu could accumulate land, or Hutu could accumulate cattle and become Tutsi. And a Tutsi could marry into a Hutu family or lose his or her cattle and land and become Hutu. The categories were somewhat fluid, but colonization changed all that. The colonizers fixed ethnicity into rigid categories and required everyone to wear identity cards or to have identity cards that designated them as either Hutu or Tutsi. So by the time independence came in 1962, the mistrust and animosity between these groups had grown deep. Even though the Germans and then later the Belgians had privileged the Tutsis, the Hutus, the majority population, at the time of independence, gained control of the government. The 1994 genocide was planned and carried out by the Hutu government, by the Hutu military and government officials. Certain people who had power in government wanted to exterminate the nation's Tutsis because they feared that the Tutsis would re-enter the country and come back into power and condemn the Hutus to a kind of subservience that they had suffered in the past. Western news outlets and later movies portrayed the conflict as classic tribal hatred. Americans were led to believe that Hutus, really whoever they were, because we'd mostly never heard about them before, really hated Tutsis, whoever they were, because we'd really never ever heard about them before, and that it was this kind of hatred, like all kind of tribal hatred, that went back, we were led to believe, hundreds, if not thousands, of years. Why do they hate each other, we might have wondered? I don't know. Who knows? It's an African thing. That's the message that we got. Why did the media do this? Why? They did it because ancient, primordial, inexplicable hatred between tribes is what we expect out of Africa. And it's what they expect out of Africa. Complicated history, complicated politics, complicated economics? No. Now, one of the stories I find so fascinating about the Rwandan genocide is the insistence in the media, and still today in academic circles, that a radio station controlled by the Hutu government called RTLM, that this Hutu radio station sparked the genocide by imploring Hutus to kill Tutsis. In fact, the classic image of the perpetrator in this genocide is one of a killer with a machete in one hand and a transistor radio in the other. And American movies such as Hotel Rwanda and Sometimes in April reinforce this idea that hate radio incited much of the killing. So, we have, is this working? I want to go back. Give me a slide, please. Thank you. This is why we have a professor here. And we just want, this is mostly audio. It's playing, but you can't hear it, can you?
Now they have come back.
Okay, so can we go back?
When people ask me, why do I hate all the Tutsi? I say, read our history. The Tutsi were collaborators for the Belgian colonists. They stole our Hutu land. They whipped us. Now they have come back, these Tutsi rebels. They are cockroaches. They are murderers. Rwanda is our Hutu land. We are the majority. They are a minority of traitors and invaders. We will squash the infestation. We will wipe out the RPF rebels. This is RTLM, Hutu Power Radio. Stay alert. Watch your neighbors.
Really? Is radio really that powerful? Is radio so seductive that when listeners hear it, they go out and kill their neighbors, their friends, their family members? Have you ever heard of another place where radio, or any mass medium, is as powerful as this? If your favorite radio commentator told you to go kill your neighbor, would you go do it? Of course not. Then why did we assume that Rwandans would respond to radio in this way? We do this, I think, because we're sure that Africans are unsophisticated, suggestible, easy to lead astray, capable of being pulled into terrible violence by voices that they hear on the radio. We wouldn't do this, but they're unlike us, or at least we want to assume. However, there's a problem. Hate radio wasn't responsible for provoking the genocide, and there's a lot of good research out there that supports this assertion. Hate radio, or Hutu radio, radio RTLM, did not reach large segments of the country. The genocide was national. The radio broadcasts were not national. The most inflammatory broadcasts, where Tutsis were called cockroaches, where Hutus were called to defend the nation, where the radio told people to fight, to kill, to exterminate, occurred after the first 3 weeks of the genocide. This after is important because the first 3 weeks of the genocide is when most of the killing occurred. In some areas, 85% of the killing had already occurred during the first 3 weeks of the genocide. So all the inflammatory stuff was after much of the genocide had already taken place. And perpetrators of violence say they participated in genocide because friends, family, and neighbors pressured them into it, or forced them into it, or because they simply wanted to. They believed in the cause. But practically nobody says that they killed because of what they heard on the radio. Now, our mass media loved the hate radio story because it made the genocide simple and understandable. Ancient, primordial, tribal animosities were hanging over the country. Extremists got a hold of power on radio. They told their allies to kill, and before you knew it, neighbors were killing neighbors. The hate radio angle satisfied our need to see Africa and Africans as unlike us, as our opposites. We're pretty sure that we'd never commit such evil acts. We're not like them. They're not like us. But of course they are like us, and of course we are like them. Political leaders manipulated the fear of their followers and convinced a sizable number of them that the most drastic imaginable action was required to preserve the way of life that was so dear to them. This is exactly what Raoul Wallenberg saw happening in Central Europe 65 years ago. Ordinary people in the lands controlled by Hitler were capable of mass killings without provocation. And so were Rwandans. Hutu Rwandans aren't any more intrinsically evil or any more easily duped than our friends and family in Germany, or we ourselves today. Politics, economics, and evil leadership lined up in a certain way in Germany in 1930 and 1940s, in Rwanda in the 1990s, and genocide could happen anywhere because fundamentally we're all capable of the same basic capacity to evil. And we don't have a sound on this. Perpetrator. Perpetrator. Survivor. Perpetrator. Perpetrator. Survivor. 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 Perpetrator. These are from Robert Lyons' book, Intimate Enemies. My second case extends into a more recent period. The civil wars of Liberia, which spread into neighboring Sierra Leone, These were protracted and extremely ugly wars that lasted from 1989 until 2008. These wars were of very little interest to American news organizations. But when Liberia and Sierra Leone did make it onto the television screen, we saw what made these wars infamous. Horrific images of men, women, and children with their arms hacked off, with pictures of child soldiers obviously drugged, behaving like maniacs, severed heads, severed psyches, and severed land. Unfortunately, I can't give you a straightforward narrative about what happened in Liberia and how Liberia's war spilled into neighboring Sierra Leone and how Liberia's war destabilized the entire West Africa region. I can't do it. And if I can't do it after studying and working in West Africa for more than 20 years, think about the trepidation of some poor journalist who gets a phone call in 1990 or a phone call in 2000 from an editor who says, hey, you're going to Monrovia. But let me try to give you some context with some explanation for what happened in Liberia during those years. Start with the fact that Liberia was created by freed American slaves who settled there and declared Liberia a republic in 1847. The Liberian Constitution was modeled on the American one. It was written at Harvard University. For more than 100 years, this community of freed slaves and their descendants controlled almost every aspect of political and economic life in Liberia, even though there was a sizable, large, indigenous African population who were not descended from the freed slaves. Not until well into the 20th century could the majority of the population, that is, the indigenous Africans, those who were not descendants from the freed slaves, not until the 20th century could they vote or own land. In 1980, Master Sergeant Samuel Doe and his entourage murdered President William Tolbert and most of his cabinet, threatened the small community of slave descendants, and created a corrupt dictatorship that had one objective: to enrich Doe and his network of allies. Washington tolerated Doe because he was a staunch anti-communist who did the bidding of the U.S. government. However, by 1989, the end of the Cold War, Doe was no longer relevant on the geopolitical stage. And when Charles Taylor, a guy who had an economics degree from an American university, invaded Liberia with the intent to overthrow Doe, he had Washington's blessings, more or less. I'm going to show you a clip that unfortunately I edited, so it's going to be a little rough, but it's from a 1989 broadcast that frames for you, I think, how the American media saw this conflict in Liberia. I'm going to stand here because I think I need to do that.
It is a war that has made headlines here because American lives and property are in danger. But what's really happening in Liberia? Tonight, a unique behind-the-scenes look at rebel forces in battle and their leader as we focus on Liberia's brutal civil war.
This is ABC News Nightline, reporting from Washington.
No hope. Thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, have been killed in the Civil War, a conflict fueled by tribal hatreds and atrocities by both sides.
The killings have never stopped. The mayhem has never stopped. The country is going downhill. It's ruined. The economy is ruined. Everything is just, it's just taking a backward turn.
If it weren't for the bloodshed, it would almost be comical. These are the people Taylor says will help restore democracy to Liberia. Young people, uneducated people, tripping out on the thrill of taking part in revolution. dressed in clothes they've stolen along the way. Their idea of a good war is the chance to steal more.
We are the commanders.
There is no chain of command here, but there is magic and superstition. This rebel is holding the leg bone of a government soldier he says he killed. He thinks it'll bring him good luck. One thing for sure, this is not war as we know it. There's no air force or navy, no grand military strategy aimed at seeking out the enemy. This is Africa, and in Africa, the enemy often finds you.
The country had been falling apart since Dough's coup in 1980, but it really disintegrated under Taylor, and Taylor is the man whom you saw speaking on the tape. Taylor's army split into several independent, multi-ethnic militias because there was more to be gained by going independent. The various militias went after each other, and in the process, they plundered the country. Mutilation, rape, forced labor, forced soldiering, forced child soldiering, wanton murder of civilians ensued. Some 250,000 Liberian civilians, farmers, shopkeepers, day laborers, teachers, were murdered by the militias over the course of 14 years. Militia leaders began competing with each other for who could commit the most heinous abuses. What did the horrible crimes committed by the militias accomplish? They kept opposing militias afraid and at bay, and they kept the people of Liberia in abject fear. They kept money, drugs, diamonds, weapons flowing. There was no political ideology except for get rich quick, mostly off the region's diamond mines. These civil wars and the wanton violence, first in Liberia and then in Sierra Leone, were mostly, or almost entirely, about rival bands of thugs competing with each other for control of diamonds, drugs, weapons, control of portions of the country that gave them ready access to these things, and control of the governments, either Liberian or Sierra Leone, the control of the governments of the countries, because political control makes plunder easier and bestows legitimacy upon the plunderers. The title of Taylor's earliest operations into Sierra Leone pretty much sums up the wars. Operation Pay Yourself. Another short little clip.
They've managed to reach a new level of ferociousness here, and a new level of madness as well. The fighters think they're immune. They're not.
Someone get it, please. The wars in Liberia and Sierra Leone preceded the Rwandan genocide and carried on 8 and 9 years afterward. In Rwanda, you had clear good guys and bad guys. Even though our media truncated and reduced the complexity of Rwanda's history to primordial tribal hatreds, Hutus versus Tutsis, at least we had some understanding of who the players were. Liberia and Sierra Leone's civil wars wiped away governance, replaced the rule of law with thuggery and barbarism. Only a few of the most horrific acts of violence made their way into Western news reports and later into movies, but always framed by their perennial trope. Violence in Africa is primordial, primitive, senseless, and black. A cult of personality developed around the chief thug, Charles Taylor, who was this articulate, slightly American accented man, charismatic man. Was he good? Was he bad? If your sources were the American news, it was hard to tell. Sometimes Taylor seemed so sincere about the welfare of Liberia, and sometimes he seemed so utterly innocent of mass violence in Sierra Leone. Militia leaders, too, could have their charms. Prince Johnson, now a member of the Liberian Parliament, could sound very sincere about Liberia's welfare on camera. And others were clearly bad guys. Joshua Blahi, also known as General Butt Naked, now a prominent preacher in Monrovia. And child soldiers, where do we place them? Victims? Perpetrators? Both? Not generally. This will be the last one. There should be music. We're going to get music here. Liberia virtually disappeared from the global media state. But YouTube brought back Liberia's grisliness. Almost immediately, sociopathic, politicopathic productions of recycled news images found their way via amateur music videos into YouTube's deep, dark corners. What is interesting and disturbing about the video that you just saw is that many of the kinds of productions employ and celebrate the very kinds of images the world had turned away from during Liberia's 14 years of civil war. Videos like Holiday in Monrovia vividly display the worst of Liberia, the black and primordial qualities of media depictions of violence in Africa, and Africa's excellence as an exemplar of dystopian vision and a bleak human future. So what can we conclude? Some of you will want to say, or at least you'll be thinking to yourselves, that the four simplifications that I outlined in the first half of my talk and tried to weave into my 2 case studies have some basis in truth. Don't these case studies prove, after all, that Africa is, unlike us, a land of unusually sharp contrast between good and evil, a land where problems are rooted in deep and impenetrable history, a land where primordial hatreds between groups continue to manifest themselves in horrendous atrocities? Well, no. It might surprise you to learn that some of the best research in the last few years on comparative mass violence shows quite clearly that Africa is not unusually prone to warfare for mass violence. According to some very interesting research by my colleague Scott Strauss in the Political Science Department at Wisconsin, and according to some other independent comparative work by a fellow young Minnesotan at the Humphrey Institute at University of Minnesota, Derek Cohen, Africa in the last 20 years has been less prone to civil war than the 2 other regions. Less prone to civil war than the 2 other world regions, namely Asia and the Middle East. Furthermore, the duration of civil wars in the other episodes of mass violence in Africa have been shorter than in Asia and the Middle East. And the incidence of the worst atrocities, including sexual violence, has not been greater in Africa than on other continents. It's true that Strauss's findings at least suggest that though things have been in the last decade or 2 in Africa worse than in the Americas and in Europe, they have been better than in the Middle East and Asia. Africa is not the violent basket case that we assume it to be. Why do we have such a hard time believing that this could be true? Well, one reason is that Africa is home to 54 different countries. And both Strauss and Cohen base their calculations on a per-country basis. Because what other reasonable measure is there? Africa is not one country. The fact is, Africa does have 54 different polities, and at any given time, the majority of them are peaceful. Now, I think the reason that we're surprised to learn that the incidence, duration, and severity of mass violence in Africa over the last 20 years is not the worst in the world is that our simplifying assumptions that I laid out earlier are so deeply ingrained in the storytelling of our media and so deeply ingrained in our own minds. We expect out of Africa sharp contrast to the West, great evil and pitiful innocence, problems rooted in a knowable prehistory, and tribalism, and tribalism. So that's what we look for. That's what the media give us. And that's what the media expect, that we want. So we end up in a vicious circle of self-perpetuating delusion. I'm not making light of the violence that still plagues Africa, that is still ongoing in Africa. But as Raoul Wallenberg taught us more poignantly than just about anyone in Western history, evil must be labeled evil wherever it occurs. It has to be fought wherever it occurs. Raoul Wallenberg's moral and physical courage was exceptional. Few of us are called to his level of engagement or personal sacrifice. But in our own small ways, all of us can follow his lead. My story has been intended to tell you that in the case of the way that our media tells stories about violence in Africa, we can make a solid, small, personal contribution by forcing ourselves to dig a little deeper for underlying truths. terrible violence does not happen in Africa because that's just the way things are in Africa. No, this is no truer than the assertion that Germany as a nation was uniquely predisposed to hatred. As we've seen, the terrible violence that we assume to happen in Africa is more rampant, more widespread in other regions. When mass violence occurs in Africa, when it occurs anywhere, there are specific historical, political, and economic situations that underlie it. Look for them. Insist on the media's responsibility to try to help us understand them. So I want to thank you for your patience and for coming out tonight. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions. Yeah.
Well, I mean, if like there's biases behind the media, what should we actually trust then? Or what should we look for? Like you said, look for underlying meanings, but if our mass media doesn't give us that, who should we trust?
It's not just the mass media, it's you too. Okay?
Yeah.
It's you too. We have been raised in a culture where we have learned, and in part it's much informed by our own race relations in this country, where we have certain assumptions that we make about blackness. And those ideas, people who work in the media are cultural actors just like you and I are cultural actors. And so who do you trust if you can't trust the media? Well, you have to go looking. You have to take the responsibility for learning about Africa, for learning African history, for understanding the dynamics, for not being willing to accept that any time that there's some kind of mass violence that occurs, that, oh, that's just the way Africans are, or that kind of stuff always happens over there, wouldn't happen over here like this. You have to take it upon yourself to be a part of that kind of rethinking the way that we think about Africa. And how do you get the media to participate in that? Well, I don't know. I like to believe that education is a big part of that. That you learn more about different parts of the world, whether it be Africa or Latin America or other places. And that you become more critical consumers of the news. And for those of you who want to be journalists some days or storytellers some days, you take it upon yourself then to not reinforce those kinds of assumptions, those kinds of biases that we do carry with us. Does that make sense? Yeah.
You talked in your presentation about connections between colonialization in Africa and subsequent violence, such as in the case of Rwanda. I wonder if you could comment a little bit on neo-colonialism and violence in Africa.
I'm just going to do this because I can't stand this thing shaking around any longer. I couldn't move during my talk because of this thing. Yes, neocolonialism. Certainly Africa is still connected and certainly marginalized in the world economy and on the political stage in ways that it always has been. But I think that a lot of African leaders are now saying, you know, we can't just kind of lean on that. We've got to, on our own, stake out what it is that we need to do and strike out on our own to be more forceful in the kinds of policies that we want to pursue and the way that we try to work with governments of Europe and the United States in trying to pursue policies that are going to be most effective for us. And one of the things that you do see is a great deal more cooperation now, regional cooperation between African states, which is relatively new. Before it was always, you know, if you were, it was going to go back to France or back to Britain or back to Belgium and then come back to Africa. Now there's a lot of discussion and work among African countries. It changes the dynamics somewhat, but certainly, yeah, neocolonialism is part of that picture. That's why Africa is still marginalized politically and economically. I don't think, if I didn't answer your question quite.
No, thank you.
Who else? I can't have been perfectly clear. It's never happened before.
Do you have any definitive suggestions beyond just education on how we can change our cultural perception of the media as truth to something that we criticize, look inwardly at our own culture? Any suggestions on how we can do that, make that change for the entire populace?
For the entire population. I get asked this question all the time, and it would be great if we could do that, wouldn't it? It would be great if we didn't hate certain groups of people because of who they were racially, in terms of sexuality, in terms of ethnicity or class. All those kinds of discriminations, all those kinds of biases would be great to get rid of, wouldn't it? And if you've got an answer for how to do that, you're going to be the next Nobel laureate who's going to be giving a talk here. But I don't mean to make light of your question. It's a serious question. And I don't know that there is an easy answer for that. I mean, I've been thinking about this stuff for 20 years. And so what do? My idea, the only thing that I feel like I can do is I work with journalists to help them to think more critically about what they're doing and why they're doing it, and how they're telling a story, and alternate ways that they can tell a story. I teach African studies because that's my one way of being an activist, to be able to educate people about the kinds of assumptions that we think, the kinds of stuff that we think that we know, that we really don't know. And so I'm going to fail miserably to answer your question, because there isn't a question. It has to be by cultural consensus that we decide not to discriminate, decide not to hold these cultural biases, not just about Africa, but name your group, name your cause, name your all the discriminations that we see constantly in this country: class, sexuality, gender, race, ethnicity, the gamut. What do? We have to keep talking to each other. We have to keep working on this. We have to be able to speak up and say, this is not right, shouldn't do this. You need to let this group say what they want to say. You need to let this group do what they need to do. So you have to be, in a sense, out there willing to be able to speak. And this is what Wallenberg did, right? You have to be willing to speak up for what's right. And that's really hard to do. But as I was saying towards the end, that's what Wallenberg did. That's the lesson we can take from Wallenberg, is speaking up and doing the right thing. And doing it even in times when we feel like we're going to be made fun of, or that we might be wrong, or that we're going to get into trouble somehow, but still feeling that the moral imperative is there to do right by other people. So, sorry, I failed to answer your question. Who else?
I was wondering if you could share a story of media within Africa being used for peace or conflict resolution, maybe from something training you've been involved in, or how it comes to mind.
Yeah, where media in Africa have been used for peace, for conflict resolution, a lot of it, one might think of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and actually those get more bogged down in politics than they actually do a lot of times with truth-telling or trying to build consensus and peace. Where you see sort of more peace-building writing that is done is really with a lot of humanitarian and human rights organizations that journalists are working for. And they're not necessarily Western humanitarian organizations. The most effective ones are those that are Africa-based. And they let the African journalists then tell stories that are personalized and that are regionalized and that make sense to Africans about African experiences, rather than being filtered through some Westerner's eyes about Africa. So in that sense, that's where you get, I think, the really important storytelling done, is by Africans talking about their own realities and talking to their own audiences, rather than speaking out to Westerners, talking to people inside of their own countries, inside of their own communities. That's where the powerful stuff is. And some of that's done print, but a lot of it is done radio, and a lot of it is increasingly done, via internet. What are these things called? Facebook things, social networking. That young Africans in particular, just like you guys, like to do a lot of social networking. Now, the difficulty for them is the cost of being able to have access to a computer and being able to afford to go to a cyber cafe to use computers and so forth. But there are blogs that a lot of young people have put together that sort of explain their day-to-day experiences and what it's like to live and how much do they live on every day. And those are compelling, powerful, beautiful stories. And they may not be written in the best French or the best English around, but if more of us went to those kinds of sites and looked at those stories, we'd see a whole different way of life that we don't much think about. Yeah.
I'm just thinking, I really appreciate your reading of or interpretation of Hotel Rwanda, but I just remember that film being accepted so well, and I think
because
people got a sense of what they were, that they had some insight that they wouldn't have otherwise had, and I'm wondering what you think about film as sort of, does it need to be a documentary film, or is the failure?
I don't really have a big beef with Hotel Rwanda. Well, okay, I kind of do. It's a good movie. Whenever you watch it, it's a compelling movie. Sometimes in April, it's a compelling movie. And, in Hotel Rwanda, Don Cheadle is great. He's so compelling. He's so sincere. He's so well dressed. So it's a compelling film. But the problem is that it's a very, very simple telling of the genocide. And it's a telling that makes one man into the hero, when in fact there were lots of heroes in the Rwanda genocide. And there were lots of people who died being heroes because they refused to kill other people or because they were protecting people. So this is, and you also know that, I can't think of his name right now, Paul. Yeah, so now he's under indictment for all sorts of things. And that's not terribly surprising, because if you read accounts of the way that he was running the hotel, there was certainly a lot of scamming that was going on, a lot of profit making that was going on. If you really wanted to tell a story about a hero who was moving refugees through that same hotel, it would have been a captain in the Unimir troops, a Senegalese captain, who was actually very, very good and did not take money and got a lot of refugees through the hotel and out of the country. So what's my beef about Hotel Rwanda? One, it sets up for this story that radio was so compelling, and that radio was in some ways the instigator of the genocide. That's what I really wanted to point out, that it's not radio. I mean, it's silly when these stories about Hutu radio first started coming out. I thought this can't be the case, because nobody reacts to the media in that way. Nobody listens to a radio broadcast because, darn good idea, I'm going to go kill my neighbor today. Media don't have that kind of power. And yet we were absolutely willing to believe that radio could have that kind of power in Rwanda. And we did, as I suggested, because of these kinds of biases. So the problem with a movie like Hotel Rwanda, and here's where the critical skills have to come in, is you have to think, really? Would a radio station have that kind of impact? Am I really going to buy that? What do I really know about how media have an influence on people? Would I do that in the same situation? No, I wouldn't do that. Why would I expect these Rwandans to be like that? So nothing is so bad about, God, we don't have to have all documentaries all the time. That's not the point. But it is to say that all kinds of media set up storytelling in particular ways, from particular vantage points. And you just have to come and figure out what those are, and what they're trying to get, what kind of point that they're trying to get you to buy into.
Thank you all so much for, one more? Okay, one more.
I was just wondering if the people that you work with in Western Africa, they know the kind of impression that the Western media gives them. If they do, what reactions do they have?
Oh, absolutely they know, because, I mean, CNN is everywhere, and cable news networks, of American and British and French variety, are all over the continent. So people are very, very aware of American media images of Africans. And a lot of times when I come in to do training workshops, people will say, we're not really like that. We're not, this kind of violence that happened in such and such country, yes, it was bad violence, but it's not about because we belong to this particular ethnic group, or it's not about that. It's about, so-and-so wanted power, or it's about economics, or it's about these other things. And people, I think, in so many ways are either angry by it or hurt by it. Because it's incredible, I think, to at least the journalists that I've worked with before, that Americans could actually believe such simple ideas about Africans. It's this idea that really you don't think that we're any more sophisticated, that we're not a lot like you. And when I talk about movies again, when I show movies that are made in Africa by Africans for Africans, and it will show a city like Dakar, for instance, some of my students will say, they've got skyscrapers? Well, yeah, it's a big city. It's 3 million people. Sure, they've got skyscrapers. They've got roads. Yeah, they've got roads. So, Africans know that those are our kinds of impressions, that we have that little knowledge, that little interest in their lives and what they're doing. Now, if I have one more second. Okay. A lot of people say, well, the reason that Americans don't pay a lot of attention to mass violence in Africa is this idea of compassion fatigue. Now, I'm going to make a plea here. This is a cruddy concept. Because compassion fatigue, it sounds quite reasonable. Oh, I'm so tired of atrocities, I think I'll watch reruns of Law and Order instead. Compassion fatigue is really to say that we've actually ever paid any attention as an audience to atrocities in Africa. We don't have compassion fatigue. Media might have compassion fatigue because they don't want to cover those stories. But as audiences, we're not having compassion fatigue because we don't pay attention to them in the first place. So you can't have fatigue until you've got interest. And we don't have that interest either. And Africans, come back to the questions, that's what Africans understand very well, is that Americans don't have that kind of interest. And they'll say things like, yeah, but you've got a huge African-American population. Why aren't you, this was the birthplace of humanity. You've got African-Americans who came from here. Why? I don't have any explanation other than this plays in to our own culture, our own set of race relations, where blackness is marginalized. Does that answer? Kind of? Maybe?
Thank you, Dr. Fair. Thank you all for